Welcome to All Angles History. I'm Matt Gorin, and this is episode 5. Today, we step into one of the most critical turning points in the history of Vietnam. The war with the French was over, but for Ho Chi Minh, the struggle was far from finished. Despite his best efforts, the country he fought so hard to unify was now divided. North and South Vietnam stood as two halves of a broken whole. How did we get here, and what could have been different? October 1954 marked Ho Chi Minh's return to Hanoi after 8 years of exile. With the French finally departing, Ho assumed control of North Vietnam. But for Ho, this moment of triumph was bittersweet. His dream of a unified Vietnam was being dictated by foreign powers, and the division at the 17th parallel threatened to make that dream unattainable. According to the Geneva Accords, reunification elections were supposed to take place in 1956. With the aim of establishing a single government for all Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, who had immense popular support across the country, was expected to win in a landslide. It's estimated that he would have secured more than 80% of the vote. The South, under No Dien Diem, knew this, and it's no surprise that they refused to allow the elections to happen. To justify their refusal, Diem's regime, with US support, launched an aggressive propaganda campaign against Ho Chi Minh, painting him as a ruthless dictator. These efforts were designed to turn the South against the North, but the reality on the ground was different. While Ho's regime certainly had its flaws, particularly with the brutal land reforms, life under Diem's rule was also marred by corruption, repression, and severe human rights abuses. In the South, Diem rose to power, propped up by American support. But while he claimed to be a defender of democracy, his rule was far from just. Diem's regime was deeply corrupt, brutally suppressing opposition and alienating large segments of the population, particularly the Buddhist majority. The South, which the US had hoped would stand as a bulwark against communism, was crumbling from within. While Ho Chi Minh was vilified by the South's propaganda machine, it became increasingly clear that life in Diem's South Vietnam was no better, and in some cases, even worse than in the North. Political opponents were jailed or killed, and the religious tensions reached a boiling point. The very freedoms that Diem had promised his people were nowhere to be found. For Ho Chi Minh, this situation was deeply frustrating. Years earlier, he had reached out to the United States for support, even working with American OSS agents during World War II. The OSS had been the precursor to the CIA. There had been a fleeting moment when a US-Vietnam alliance seemed possible, but it vanished with the death of OSS agent Peter Dewey. Dewey, who had advocated for Vietnamese independence, was killed by the Viet Minh in a tragic case of mistaken identity for a French officer. Ho's overtures were ignored by Washington, and the US continued to back Diem, deepening the divide. In 1954, as Diem rose to power in the South, the US began funneling money into his regime. Initially, President Eisenhower provided $100 million in aid, but that figure quickly ballooned as the US became more entrenched in South Vietnam's politics. Eisenhower was determined to show the world that he was tough on communism, but in doing so, the US was supporting a regime that lacked legitimacy and was disconnected from its people. As American dollars flowed into the South, Diem's government grew more corrupt and oppressive. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh had something Diem could never buy: unwavering support from the people. Ho's vision of a unified, independent Vietnam had captured the hearts of millions, both in the North and the South. From the beginning of his revolutionary journey, Ho Chi Minh's mission was clear. He sought to uplift Vietnam's poor, particularly its peasants. For centuries, they had been bound to the land, subjected to the whims of landlords and foreign occupiers. Ho envisioned a new Vietnam, one where the people could finally own the land that they had worked for generations. In Ho's eyes, land reform was not just a policy, it was a moral imperative, a path to justice. Between 1953 and 1956, the North Vietnamese government embarked on an ambitious agrarian reform campaign. Ho believed that by breaking the power of the landholding elite and giving land to the peasants, he could finally free the Vietnamese people from centuries of exploitation. But the reality of these reforms turned out to be far more brutal than Ho or perhaps anyone could have anticipated. Thousands of landlords were put on trial, accused of being enemies of the people, These trials were swift and merciless. The Vietnamese government, eager to showcase the redistribution of power, carried out mass executions. Estimates vary, but it's believed that somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 landlords were executed during this period. Many were publicly humiliated, stripped of their land, and killed in front of the very people who once worked for them. One has to wonder, how did Ho Chi Minh reconcile these brutal acts with his deep-rooted belief in the dignity and worth of every Vietnamese person? Was this mass violence truly what he had envisioned for this country? Or was he, too, swept up in the fervor of the revolutionary change? Could he have foreseen the human toll that his policies would take on his own people? Ho would later admit that mistakes had been made. In 1956, as the scale of the atrocities became clear, he initiated a correction of errors campaign, acknowledging the severe wrongs that had occurred. The government released thousands of political prisoners and sought to return land to those who had been wrongly dispossessed. But the damage had already been done, and the violence of the reforms would leave a stain on Ho's legacy. Looking back, we have to ask, was this chapter in Vietnam's history truly out of character for Ho Chi Minh, the leader who had dedicated his life to his people's freedom? Or was it simply the grim reality of revolution, where idealism clashes with the complexities of power and control? Ho had always portrayed himself as a man of the people, and yet here we see him presiding over policies that led to widespread death and suffering. Could he have foreseen the human toll that his policies would have taken on his own people? These events may have strengthened Ho's grip on the North, but for those in the South, this brutality only confirmed the worst of the propaganda they had ever been fed. For many, the executions, trials, and purges in the North cemented Ho Chi Minh's image as a ruthless dictator. Even as he fought to build a more just society, his actions alienated a significant portion of his own people. The seeds had been sown, and as Vietnam's future hung in the balance, these divisions would play a critical role in the war to come. Ho's legacy, both revered and reviled, would shape the course of Vietnam's future. In the North, he was seen as a liberator, a visionary who dared to take on the entrenched powers. But in the South, the agrarian reforms and the tales of violence only solidified him as a threat to their way of life. As the conflict between North and South Vietnam escalated, these perceptions would drive the two sides further apart, paving the way for an even larger struggle, one that would soon draw in the United States and transform Vietnam into the next major battleground of the Cold War. As the dust settled on the brutal agrarian reforms in the North, the world's attention shifted to Geneva. It was 1954, July, and after nearly a decade of bloodshed in the First Indochina War, representatives from Vietnam, France, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and others gathered in Switzerland to negotiate peace. The stakes could not have been higher. What would emerge from these talks would not only decide the fate of Vietnam, but also lay the groundwork for the next great conflict. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh and the communist Viet Minh, would retain control of the territory above the line. The South would remain under the authority of the French-backed state of Vietnam, soon to be led by the fiercely anti-communist Dien. This temporary division was meant to last only 2 years, with national elections scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. To many, the accord seemed like a diplomatic victory, a chance to end years of fighting, but Ho Chi Minh was all too aware of the harsh reality. He had fought for decades to free his country from foreign domination, only to watch as Vietnam was once again divided. This time, not by invaders, but by diplomats in faraway Geneva. The accords were a compromise, yes, but they felt like yet another betrayal of the Vietnamese people's right to self-determination. For Ho, this division of his beloved Vietnam was a bitter pill to swallow. He had liberated the North, but his dream of a unified, independent Vietnam remained out of reach. The elections that were supposed to reunify the country never came. Diem, with the backing of the United States, refused to allow them, knowing he would not win. Had those elections been held in 1956, Ho Chi Minh's legitimacy would have been undeniable. After all, his leadership had galvanized the people during the fight against colonialism. Yet, instead of democratic reunification, Vietnam remained split, and the Cold War tensions between communism and capitalism solidified the division. The people of Vietnam were caught in the middle, and Ho was once again forced to prepare for the possibility of another war. The Geneva Accords were supposed to be a solution, but for Ho Chi Minh, they represented the beginning of yet another struggle. This time, not just against colonial powers, but against the ever-growing influence of the United States. The 17th parallel wasn't just a dividing line. It was the boundary between two visions of Vietnam's future. For Ho, the fight was far from over. As 1956 approached and left, the promised elections were never materialized. Ho Chi Minh found himself in control of the North, but his vision of a unified Vietnam remained just out of reach. The South, led by an increasingly corrupt regime, was propped up by American money and military aid. It was only a matter of time before the conflict would reignite, and this time, American advisors and soldiers would find themselves on the ground of Vietnam. In our next episode, we'll explore how the fragile peace gave way to the Vietnam War and how Ho Chi Minh prepared for the long and brutal struggle ahead. The stage was set for one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century.